10 years in prison, $100,000 in fines for owning gold, not stealing it, not smuggling it, just having it. That was the final scorecard, the part nobody forgets once they hear it. In 1933, the United States government looked its own citizens in the eye and said, that shiny little insurance policy you're clutching, the one humanity trusted for 5,000 years? Hand it over, or prepare to meet a judge. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a proposal. It was the law stamped, signed, and delivered under the polite, bureaucratic name of Executive Order 6102. Imagine the whiplash. Yesterday, gold was safety. Today, it's contraband. Your grandfather's coins, your wedding jewelry, the emergency stash buried in a coffee can, out back suddenly glow like evidence in a police locker. The government doesn't kick down your door immediately. It does something far more unsettling. It gives you a deadline, a calm voice saying, you have until May 1st. After that, you're a criminal. And here's the part that should make your skin crawl. Millions complied, not because they loved the idea, but because fear is a powerful anesthetic. The banks were collapsing, jobs were evaporating, and the state wrapped this order in the language of patriotism. This wasn't theft, they said. This was sacrifice. For the nation, for recovery, for the greater good. You can almost hear the unspoken line hanging in the air. Trust us. We know what we're doing. To understand why Americans didn't riot in the streets when gold was outlawed, you have to step into the fog of the early 1930s. This was not a normal recession. This was an economic apocalypse in slow motion. Banks didn't just fail. They vanished overnight, taking life savings with them like a bad magic trick. One day your money existed on paper. The next day the doors were locked and the signs were gone. Trust didn't erode, it detonated. In that chaos, gold stopped being an investment and became a talisman. A coin in the hand felt more real than a promise in a ledger. People lined up not just for bread, but for certainty. They stuffed gold under mattresses, sewed it into coats, buried it in fields like medieval peasants, hiding from an invading army. This wasn't greed. This was survival instinct. Paper dollars were still money, but everyone knew the dirty secret. Paper only works when faith works, and faith was in free fall. The gold standard, that old gentleman's agreement, tying money to something tangible, turned into a double-edged sword. On one side, it was the last thing people trusted. On the other, it handcuffed the government. Prices were collapsing, debts were getting heavier, and every dollar was chained to a fixed amount of gold sitting in vaults. The economy needed oxygen, but the gold standard kept the mask sealed tight. So while families clutched coins like life rafts, policymakers stared at charts like doctors watching a patient turn blue. Something had to give. Either the economy broke free from gold, or gold would be blamed for strangling the economy. And when panic meets power, history shows us exactly which side usually loses. Then came the man with the smile that said everything was under control. Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't storm into Washington like a tyrant. He arrived like a doctor, sleeves rolled up, voice calm, telling the patient to relax while reaching for the scalpel. America was desperate for confidence, and Roosevelt served it warm, reassuring, and nonstop. Fireside chats, plain language, a steady hand on the radio telling you the problem wasn't the system, it was panic, and panic, he promised, could be cured. Here was the argument, boiled down and sugar-coated for mass consumption. People were hoarding gold. Hoarding gold meant less money circulating. Less money circulating meant falling prices, frozen wages, and an economy stuck in molasses. If gold could be shaken loose, the blood would flow again. Simple. Clean. Almost elegant. The villain wasn't bad policy or reckless banks. It was you, hiding coins under your floorboards. And the beauty of the pitch was that it sounded patriotic. Turning in your gold wasn't surrender. It was service. The government didn't say, "We're taking your property." It said, "We're saving the economy." A national emergency became a universal excuse, a magic phrase that made old rules feel outdated, even selfish. Private ownership suddenly looked like a luxury the country could no longer afford. You can hear the mock dialogue playing out across kitchen tables. "It's temporary," says the state. "It's necessary," says the expert. "Everyone else is doing it," says the neighbor. And quietly, almost invisibly, the idea of limits on government power is folded up and placed in a drawer labeled "later." Roosevelt didn't frame the move as radical. He framed it as inevitable. And inevitability is the most dangerous sales pitch of all. Because once people believe there is no alternative, resistance doesn't need to be crushed. It dissolves on its own. This is the moment where the polite language ends and the machinery clicks into place. The order goes out, not debated, not voted on in the way people imagine democracy working, just declared. A few paragraphs of legal prose, cold as a bank vault, announcing that nearly all privately held gold must be delivered to the Federal Reserve. Coins, bullion, certificates. Exceptions are narrow, technical, and deliberately confusing, like escape hatches drawn with disappearing ink. You have a deadline, a neat little date on the calendar. After that, the penalties switch on like a trap. 10 years in prison. A fine so large, it sounds almost fictional to Depression-era ears. The government doesn't need to raid every house. It doesn't need soldiers in the streets. All it needs is for you to believe that disobedience is reckless, unpatriotic, maybe even immoral. So people line up, quietly, awkwardly. Banks that failed them months earlier now act as collection points. Tellers weigh coins that once meant independence, scribble receipts, and slide paper promises back across the counter. The exchange rate is fixed, non-negotiable. Take it or take your chances with the law. This is the only buyer in town, and it has a monopoly enforced by handcuffs. Imagine the conversations. A farmer turning over gold, saved from good harvests, thinking about the bad ones still to come. A shop owner handing in coins, meant for retirement, telling himself the radio said this would fix things. A widow clutching jewelry, trying to remember if sentiment counts as an exemption. Somewhere between the front door and the bank counter, gold stops feeling like money and starts feeling like evidence. The brilliance, if you want to call it that, is in the tone. There's no screaming, no mass arrests, just forms, deadlines, and the quiet implication that good citizens comply. Bad citizens hide. And nobody wants to be on the wrong side of that line when times are already this hard. What makes this moment unforgettable isn't just the power of the state. It's the speed at which normal becomes unthinkable. A few years earlier, banning gold ownership would have sounded insane, like banning gravity. Now it's framed as common sense. Necessary. Responsible? The crisis has done its job. It has lowered expectations so far that people are grateful the government is only taking gold and not something worse. And here's the cruel irony. While citizens are told this sacrifice will stabilize prices, restore confidence, and revive the economy, none of them are allowed to ask the most obvious question out loud. What happens next? What happens once the gold is gone? Once it's locked away, counted and controlled by the same system that just admitted it was broken? The order doesn't answer that. It doesn't have to. By the time the question becomes urgent, the gold will already be out of reach. The door will be closed. The key will be in Washington. And the public, exhausted and obedient, will be standing on the outside, holding paper, hoping it still means something tomorrow. And then, once the gold is safely behind thick walls and thicker laws, the real trick is performed. No announcement, no drum roll, just a quiet recalibration of reality. The government looks at the price of gold and decides it was wrong. Not a little wrong. Very wrong. Overnight, The official price jumps. The dollar, still wearing the same name and face, suddenly buys less. This is the part they didn't advertise on the radio. When citizens handed over their gold, they were paid at the old price. Fair, legal, official. And then, almost immediately after, the rules change. Gold is revalued upward, which is a polite way of saying the government just devalued the dollar on purpose. The gold didn't become more valuable because of magic. The paper became cheaper. Slow it down, and the mechanics are brutally simple. The state now owns the gold. By raising its official price, the state increases the value of its own holdings. That difference doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from everyone who uses dollars. Savers, workers, anyone holding cash. Inflation becomes a feature, not a bug. Debts shrink. Government balance sheets breathe easier. From the citizen's perspective, this feels like betrayal with a receipt attached. You followed the law. You did the patriotic thing. You sold your gold because you were told it was necessary. And then you watched the government turn around and quietly pocket the upside. Had you held on just a little longer, the value would have been higher. But holding on would have made you a criminal. This is where outrage belongs, not in hindsight, but in logic. If gold hoarding was the problem, why reward the hoarder who confiscated it? If stability was the goal, why change the measuring stick after the transfer? The answer, of course, is power. Control over money is control over time, debt, and behavior. Once the state has that lever, it can move entire economies with a small, almost invisible push. The most effective part of the maneuver is that it doesn't feel violent. There's no single moment you can point to and say, that's when it was taken. Prices just creep. Savings just thin. Wages lag behind. The theft, if you dare use the word, is spread out over months and years, diluted until it feels like weather instead of policy. By the time people realize what happened, the argument is already over. The gold is gone. The dollar is different. And the lesson is quietly engraved into the system. When crisis hits, obedience is immediate, but the consequences are permanent. Of course, not everyone played along. History loves clean stories, but reality is messier and far more human. While millions lined up at bank counters, others did the math and decided the risk was worth it. They didn't make speeches. They didn't wave flags. They just didn't comply. Gold slipped into walls, floorboards, hollowed books. Coins crossed borders and coat linings. Jewelry suddenly became sentimental, cultural, or conveniently hard to appraise. The law sounded terrifying, but enforcement was strangely soft around the edges. The government talked like a giant, but it walked like a bureaucrat. Investigations were rare, prosecutions even rarer. Chasing every hidden coin would have required a police state the country wasn't ready to admit it wanted. So the order functioned more as psychological warfare than total confiscation. Fear did most of the work. Jewelers learned new vocabularies. Collectors memorized exemptions. Farmers argued that gold was a tool of trade, not a hoard. Immigrants, already suspicious of authority, trusted old country instincts over new country promises. Some people complied halfway, turning in just enough to sleep at night. Others buried their defiance and never spoke of it again. This uneven reality creates an uncomfortable truth. The law punished honesty more reliably than deception. Those who trusted the system handed over wealth at a discount. Those who distrusted it sometimes emerged intact, even rewarded by the later rise in gold's value. It's not a moral lesson the government likes to advertise, but it's one history repeats with depressing consistency. And yet, the myth of total compliance survives because it serves a purpose. It makes the order feel absolute, inevitable, unstoppable. In reality, it was leaky. But symbolism doesn't need perfection. It just needs enough obedience to set a precedent, enough fear to change behavior, enough silence to rewrite what people think the state is allowed to do. The real victory wasn't every ounce collected. It was the line crossed. Once Americans accepted that private gold ownership could be banned by decree, the boundary shifted forever. What mattered wasn't how many coins slipped through the cracks. What mattered was that everyone learned deep down that in an emergency, the rules you thought were permanent are actually optional. The emergency, of course, never really ended. That's the quiet punchline. The gold ban didn't fade away once the economy stabilized or the panic subsided. It settled in. Year after year, administration after administration, the restrictions stayed put. Like old furniture, no one bothered to move. What began as a temporary measure during crisis hardened into policy, and policy hardened into normal life. For decades, Americans lived in a strange contradiction. They were told they lived in a free market system, yet one of the most ancient stores of value on earth remained off limits by law. Gold ownership wasn't debated anymore. It was forgotten, pushed so far into the background that new generations assumed this was just how things worked. Emergencies, after all, are great at rewriting memory. The deeper effect wasn't about gold itself. It was about trust. The relationship between citizen and money had been permanently altered. Dollars were no longer quiet certificates of something tangible. They were instruments of policy, tools to be expanded, contracted, and redefined at will. People adjusted. They always do. They saved differently. They speculated differently. They learned unconsciously that stability now depended less on assets and more on decisions made far away by people they would never meet. And this is where the real inheritance shows up. The gold ban normalized the idea that extraordinary powers, once granted, don't rush back to their cages. They linger. They justify new controls. They become reference points the next time fear needs a solution. Each crisis builds on the last, not in legality, but in psychology. When gold ownership was finally legalized again decades later, it didn't feel like a liberation. There were no parades, no apologies. The moment passed quietly, almost politely. The system had moved on. The lesson had already been absorbed. People no longer needed gold to understand who controlled the monetary game. The ban's true legacy isn't in vaults or laws. It's in expectations. It taught a simple, durable rule. What you own is conditional, especially in a crisis. And once that idea takes root, it doesn't need to be enforced aggressively anymore. It enforces itself. So now zoom back to the present, because this story doesn't belong to dusty archives. It belongs to you. The names change. The tools get sleeker. The language becomes smoother. But the logic is identical. Crisis arrives. Fear spreads. Authority clears its throat and says, calmly, responsibly, almost kindly, this is temporary. This is necessary. This is for your own good. Today the money isn't metal. It's digital, invisible, frozen with a keystroke. Accounts can be paused, reversed, flagged, or reviewed without a single soldier leaving his desk. Back then, the state needed your cooperation to collect gold. Now it often doesn't. Compliance is baked into the system. The line forms automatically. And here's the uncomfortable continuity. In 1933, people were told that hoarding was selfish, that saving outside the system was harming everyone else. Today, the words are updated, but the accusation feels familiar. You're not being punished, you're being protected. You're not losing freedom, you're gaining stability. You're not being controlled, you're being guided. The most dangerous part is not the power itself, it's the memory loss. Many people hear the story of banned gold and file it away as ancient, unrepeatable, a relic of desperate times. But desperation is not rare, it's cyclical. And every cycle comes with the same promise. We'll give the power back later. History shows how that usually ends. Not with a bang, not with villains twirling mustaches, but with quiet adjustments that feel reasonable in the moment and irreversible in hindsight. The people in 1933 didn't think they were surrendering a precedent. They thought they were surviving. And that's the final sting. The day gold was banned wasn't about gold. It was about discovering how quickly rights turn into privileges when fear is loud enough. Once you see that, you start noticing the pattern everywhere. The props change. The script doesn't.